Welcome to Straight Outta Hull, the podcast about the Hull music scene of the 1980s and 1990s. The Housemartins have hit the big time. It is Christmas 1986 and Caravan of Love reaches number 1, only to be knocked off by the inestimable Reet Petite by Jackie Wilson. The Transit Van of Love is where we left the story last time, and sadly the rest of the lyrics of this alternative version, chanted by Hull City fans at Booth Ferry Park, is lost to the mists of time. After talking so much about a man named Paul, it is time to talk about Dave. A man called Dave joined the Housemartins in 1987, after the first album, but in time to work on the band's second. A ledger clerk in a famous Hull landmark, Crystal Garage, with its signage made out of 7 red hexagons, each letter of the word Crystal emblazoned in silver. It looked like the game board on Blockbusters. Dave joined the Housemartins after Hugh Whittaker left. Another Dave, Dave Rothery, recommended this Dave to Stan, and they set to work. As Dave was from Hull, unlike Paul, who was from just about everywhere except Hull, he brought a certain authenticity to the band's claim to be a Hull band. He had watched the decline of the docks and the aftermath of the sinking of the fishing boat, the Gaul, with the loss of all 36 crew first-hand. Dave's father, Harry, was a stand-up comedian on the local club circuit, and his mother, Flo, is somewhat obliquely referred to as Hull's best-known barmaid in that internet encyclopedia in the sky. Quite an accolade for a port city with a pub on every corner. Many of the future Housemartins went to the same school on the Hull estate, Orchard Park. Indeed, Dave Hemingway was a classmate of Hugh Whittaker at the school, and the two got heavily into drumming. When Whittaker left, it seemed natural that Dave would step in. Hemingway also sang backing vocals on the most famous song from the album he worked on, The People Who Grinned Themselves to Death. That song is Build, of which more later. For a moment, we pause the story of the Housemartins to talk about a band that shone even more briefly, although admittedly a little more brightly, as this band had hit records in America. Roland Gift has been called many things, and one of those things is the first black punk in Hull. He was in a Hull ska band called Acrylics. It would be easy to think that Roland started his most famous band, Fine Young Cannibals, but it wasn't quite like that. In Acrylics, he supported The Beat on tour. When Andy Cox and David Steele of The Beat fancied starting a new band, they asked Roland to sing for them, even though he had started off as the sax player for Acrylics. If you had seen Acrylics written down, you wouldn't immediately realise it sounds like Acrylics. Believe me. FYC are sometimes described as a Birmingham band. Although Roland grew up in Birmingham, his teenaged, music-obsessed years were spent in Hull. It is not difficult to see how someone as talented and unique as Roland Gift would make an impact on the Hull music scene. Gifted by nature as well as by name, Roland belted out the 2 hits for which FYC are best known, and they are both US number 1s, She Drives Me Crazy and Good Thing. Anyone who loves that kind of music probably still loves She Drives Me Crazy. From the opening intro riffs to the chorus and everything in between, it remains a perfect pop record to this day. Gift recently told The Guardian in December 2020 that he wished he had done more work with Cox and Steele, and it is clear that FYC suffered from the same malady as the Housemartins. They had too much talent, too much promise, and imploded as quickly as they had exploded onto a global stage at too young an age. This is not supposed to be a cautionary tale. It is mainly a story about Hull, a rebellious and sarcastic place that just happens to have more pubs, and therefore more pub bands, than any other minor British city. But there is caution here for the next pub band from Hull with big ideas. Beware of fickle success. Before we leave FYC, time for a factoid. Roland Gift's mum had a clothes shop in Hull, towards the Newland Avenue end of Grafton Street, home of Paul Heaton. David Whitfield did not fall for any of that guff about fickle success. A solo singer, he was born in Hull in 1925, and therefore too old to be a punk. He took an active part in the Second World War and became a singer after that, winning a show on the long-forgotten Radio Luxembourg called Opportunity Knocks. Both David and Opportunity Knocks went on to great things. He was a choir boy in his school years, but he really blossomed in the Royal Navy, entertaining his fellow sailors. David Whitfield is from an era when singers sang and songwriters wrote, and David was a singer with a fantastic voice. It would be easy to dismiss Whitfield from this distant plane, but to do so would be wrong. His angelic choir boy voice can be traced directly to Paul Heaton. It is not silly to wonder whether Whitfield, had he been born half a century later, would have answered Paul's call to start a band on Grafton Street. Or would it have been Paul answering Whitfield's shop window notice? To underline David's importance, you should know that David Whitfield was the first British artist to have a #1 single in both the UK and America with Cara Mia. The song remained at the top of the charts for 10 weeks, making it one of the best-selling songs of the pre-pop era, a record not even equalled until 2007 by Rihanna's double platinum track, Umbrella. Cara Mia was such a famous song, and so successful that David named his house on West Ella Way Cara Mia. It's not difficult to believe that the song paid for the house and a lot more besides. West Ella Way is a very nice cul-de-sac in Kirk Ella, perhaps the poshest of the villages joined to West Hull, but it is no palace. The humble abode speaks volumes of the times and of the personality of David Whitfield. A superstar, yes, but one who kept both feet on the pavement. Whitfield sang for TV and the movies too, working on the film I'll Find You, starring Richard Burton and Joan Collins, and he sang the theme song in a TV series called The Adventures of William Tell. After much soul-searching, he rejected a contract with a major American film studio, preferring to remain in Kirk Ella. Whitfield was a humble choir boy who broke America and died unusually young on tour in Australia in 1980. Would he have crossed paths with Paul had he lived a few more years? Is Paul aware of David and his legacy? Probably, but we haven't yet found an interview where David Whitfield's name comes up. The Housemartins by this time, in 1987, were grinning themselves to death. There was a book, long forgotten, written by Neil Postman and published in 1985. It was called Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. It most definitely inspired the Roger Waters album, Amused to Death, his further musings on war, in particular in the Middle East. What seems to have escaped most people, but seems obvious to us, is that Neil's book also inspired the name of the Housemartins' second and final album, released just 2 years after the book. Allowing for writing and recording time, the chronology is bang on. However, in his official history of the beautiful South and the Housemartins, Mike Pattenden makes no such connection. The People Who Grinned Themselves to Death is supposed to be critique of Thatcher's Britain after she won another election in 1987, fresh from her success in defeating the miners, who Paul Heaton had solidly supported in deeds as well as with words and song lyrics. Second albums are notoriously hard, and although Grinned is worth a listen today, the only catchy, fun-seeming track is Me and the Farmer. This farmer is supposed to be a gammon Tory in the grand tradition, and Me is the blister on the farmer's hand. The men and women who did all the work to make the farmer rich and won none of the profits. Yet Me and the Farmer is only number 2 on this album in the Spotify play count. It is the final track, Build, a gentle, quiet tune that has been played over 12 million times since 2008 alone. Build, recorded at the little-known Fairview Studios to the west of Hull in Willoughby, is perhaps more famous due to its lyrics, which included the following. Clambering men in big bad boots, dug up my den, dug up my roots, treated us like plasticine town. They build us up and knocked us down. Yes, Build is an anthem for the working man, released in the eye of the Thatcher storm. Perhaps the best Housemartins song that nobody can remember, it also set the scene for the band's demise, and sowed the seeds of another band that cropped up in its place. The Hull venues, then as now, include a club called the New Adelphi. The old Adelphi was a pub, but it was reincarnated just in the nick of time as far as the 1980s bands were concerned in 1984 by a man who had recently come into money called, appropriately enough, Paul Jackson. Then, as now, a major employer in Hull is Reckitt's. Back then, and until 1999, it was Reckitt and Coleman. Today they are paired with a totally unpronounceable European company, and therefore still known in Hull as Reckitt's, after their founding family, of which James in particular was a driving force. This was a man ahead of his time. Although born in Nottingham, James lived in Hull and died in Swanland, not far to the west. Giving his money and name to a library and a hospital, and later an avenue, James and family were one of the true Victorian philanthropic dynasties on a par with the shipping family, the Wilsons, the Ranks of Rank Hovis and Rank Films, and the Levers, Lever Brothers being of Port Sunlight fame in the northwest, now Unilever. Another famous Hull charity name joined Reckitt's in 1868 as a clerk. Remember the name T.R. Ferrens. James Reckitt never made an entire town, but he did make a village of 600 homes in Hull. Various mergers occurred, and our chap, Paul Jackson, found himself surplus to requirements. Perhaps Paul wasn't cut out for boot polish and starch, but he certainly was the right man to run a live music venue. He bought the terraced house on De Grey Street and opened its doors as the New Adelphi Club in October 1984. Viewed from one angle, the Adelphi is sort of a pub. With its pool table and recognition of its beer by camera, the real ale people, it wasn't a bad pub. But as a live music venue, its siren song could be heard even beyond British shores. Its reputation for burnishing and even launching a Hull music scene is unrivaled. Bands such as the Housemartins surely couldn't believe their luck when the Adelphi opened on their doorstep. Soon enough, the word would spread beyond Hull. Pulp, Oasis, Green Day, the Stone Roses, Supergrass, Mumford & Sons would all flock to its stage, described by some as shabby chic. One night, the Shaman slept on the kitchen floor after a particularly memorable show. Such was the reputation of the Adelphi that the Housemartins not only played there several times, but they signed their first record contract on its very stage. Many years later, during a show at the Humberside Ice Arena in Hull, Pulp's Jarvis Cocker demanded to be shown Paul Jackson. "Where's Yossa?" shouted Jarvis to the crowd, some of which appeared to know of whom he spoke. Jarvis wanted to tell everyone that there was a time shrouded in distant memory, when the only gigs Pulp could get were either in his hometown of Sheffield or the new Adelphi in Hull. Jarvis never forgot, and Yossa was the name of Paul Jackson's dog. Of course it was. As recently as 2009, the Ferrens Art Gallery, that Clark from Reckitt's, remember, staged a celebration of the new Adelphi's silver anniversary. For 25 years, Paul Jackson had played host to a brilliant Hull music scene. And now, 11 years after that, it is still going strong. The club, that is. After nearly grinning themselves to death, the Housemartins departed one last time for the road. There is never one reason why anything ends, or indeed begins. Paul had goaded the press once too often, which was wearing thin as musical success started to bring money. Any band that styles itself as a gang of working-class heroes can look hypocritical when gold discs turn platinum and caravans become houses, then palaces, with his and hers swimming pools and a view. Paul simply couldn't resist stirring up trouble when the publisher of the News of the World was hit by strikes when it tried to move its printing presses out of Fleet Street. Sometimes called the News of the Screws, it was one of the rags which had been hard on the Housemartins, and which later lost touch with reality to such an extent that Rupert Murdoch had to bin it overnight in 2011. Paul and Norman arrived at Wapping and the picket lines that were protesting at the destruction of the unions in newspaper publishing, just as Paul had attended picket lines for the miners years earlier. These undercurrents are blamed for the departure of Hugh Whittaker and his replacement with Dave, his school classmate, at the Housemartins drum kit. There was a hidden clue in the video for Build, which suggested the Housemartins were about to put themselves on the scrap heap after just 2 albums. Mike Pattenden's official history suggests that a TV show in Dublin brought matters to a head. Paul and Stan had one of their frequent rows, and later adjourned to a children's playground near the Grafton Street house in Hull, where they had first met. Although the two had always promised to review their position when forming the band 3 years earlier, they cannot have imagined how successful the Housemartins would become. It seems appalling that such a successful band could end so quickly and so abruptly, but that is the way of the music business. Although Norman wasn't on the slide and roundabout for this particular meeting, he was spending more and more time being a DJ. Stan wanted right out of the music business altogether, and Paul wanted to stay in music, but go in another direction. Paul takes some of the blame, accepting that he was a megalomaniac at that time, and he was labelled a control freak by Norman. Perhaps, but the Housemartins were already flying to different climes, and perhaps Paul's behaviour only sped things up. Paul took it upon himself to write a press release that was reported in the NME in January of 1988 to dissolve the Housemartins, and their formal existence was terminated on 10th of June of that year. Any future money, as in the past, would be split equally among the members. Don't forget, you can hear all of the songs mentioned in our show on the Spotify playlist at outerhull.uk. In the next episode, we look at what happened next for the members of the Housemartins. We also look at an adopted Hull band that at least began in Hull after a furniture shop on Beverley Road which used the marketing slogan, "Everything but the girl." Straight Outta Hull is presented by Lindsay Frost. It is written and produced by Paul Detman for WTD Audio.